Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you how I built my own mobile workbench for my small workshop. The workbench features a plywood top and is built from dimensional lumber. I had a couple of pieces of 3/4 inch maple plywood left over from building my daughter's bed. I thought that would make a great workbench top, so I started from there. My plan for the workbench top is to glue the two 3/4 inch pieces of plywood together to form a 1.5 inch thick top. I'm going to make my first cut with these individual pieces a little wider so that after the glue up I can cut the whole piece down to the exact dimensions and make sure it's nice and square. With the plywood panels cut, I'm now going to apply a very liberal amount of wood glue and then spread it out nice and even to get a good adherence on both sides of this board before I clamp it together. I like using Titebond 2 wood glue. It's got a good amount of adhesion and a reasonable amount of drying time. I'm spreading it all out with a plastic putty knife just to get everything nice and even. I'm going to be looking for kind of thin spots in the glue, and I'll come back and reapply, and then I'll repeat the process on the other board. The glue's all on. We just need to put these two facing pieces together and then start clamping it up. Since I finished the workbench, I have purchased more clamps, but at this point in time it took every clamp I had plus this big ratchet strap. I wanted to make sure the ratchet strap wasn't too tight, only tight enough to hold these cross pieces down and get a nice tight fit across the whole piece, but not enough to start curling up the ends of the workbench top. After letting the glue dry for a day or so, I unclamped everything and had a nice solid 1.5 inch workbench top. And I know some of y'all are going to comment on my bare feet. Yes, I'm barefoot. A lot of times I'm barefoot. Most of the time I'm wearing my shoes in the shop, just not this time. But good rule of thumb, wear your shoes in the shop. Now it's back over to the table saw to make the final cuts and make sure everything's nice and square. Both of the short ends also need to be squared up, and I'm going to be doing that cut with my circular saw with a nice finish blade on there for a nice clean cut. I'm cutting the 2x4s for the frame around the plywood top. And I always like cutting the ends off 2x4s just to give a nice clean start to my measurement for these boards. To further refine the 2x4s all the way across this build, I'm going to be ripping them down from 3.5 inches wide down to 3 inches wide. I'm going to be taking a 1/4 inch off each edge to clean up those edges and make them nice and square. I will be using pocket hole joinery and wood glue to connect every piece within this workbench. Makes everything nice and solid and is a pretty simple way of hooking everything together. I wanted the final workbench to look nice and finished, so I didn't want to have a whole bunch of pocket holes visible. So I'm trying to keep them as out of sight as I can, putting them underneath the workbench top, behind some of the legs, and just kind of keeping them as invisible as they possibly can be. I'm not going to go through the trouble of actually filling the pocket holes, but I do want them out of sight. This Craig face clamp did a great job of keeping the boards nice and level with one another, taking a little bit of the bend out of this 2x4 as I was putting the pocket hole screws in to make sure that this connection was even all the way across the board. I'm using some fairly aggressive sandpaper to even out the connection with these boards. That way there's no gaps when I attach the end board. I'll go back when everything is finished and do a finish sanding, but right now I'm running 80 grit sandpaper over the whole thing to knock down all these glue edges and especially to get the bottom of this workbench top nice and level for everything that's going to be attaching to it next. I designed the workbench apron to support on center right where the plywood and the 2x4s come together for the top. Once this is all screwed down and glued in place, it's going to be a nice rigid connection. Now I'll move on to the legs. I wanted these to sit within the apron and really lock in when I screwed everything down. So I'm taking two different 2x4s at two different lengths and gluing them together. This will save me some time and a little bit of money once I start making the cuts, rather than buying like a 4x4 and cutting that down. I may have gone a little overboard on the glue, but these things aren't coming apart. Since these boards are already cut to size, I want to make sure that before I clamp everything up, the bottom of the leg is nice and aligned so that the workbench will stand nice and level once everything's put together. After letting the glue dry overnight, I unclamped everything and started scraping off the excess glue. As I said before, I used a lot of it, so there's a lot to scrape off. But the legs came together pretty well. The workbench legs will stand flush with the corner of the apron, so I'm making careful measurements so I can make my final cut for the one piece that will be inset into the apron itself. I'll be attaching the legs with pocket hole screws, so I want to make sure that everything's nice and flush and fits fairly tightly so that it's a nice strong connection. This Japanese pull saw makes quick work of these cuts and makes them nice and accurate as well. And you guessed it, more pocket holes, a little bit of glue, and we'll get these legs attached to the workbench. And yet more pocket hole screws for the runners that go between the legs. I designed the workbench with 3 leg supports, keeping one side open. My original design accommodated a couple of carts I was storing underneath. Now, while I don't need those carts underneath anymore, the original design works just fine. It's nice and strong, and I have access to that one side underneath the workbench. Do a final check of square before I tighten everything down. The workbench is all put together, and now we work on getting it mobile. I picked up these PowerTech workbench casters, which have a lifting mechanism so that you can lift up the workbench, move it to where you need to, and put it back down. Makes it real easy and keeps everything nice and sturdy. Using measurements provided in the instructions, you simply mark where the holes need to be drilled for the mounting plates and put everything into place. And finally, I can stand this workbench on the ground and get ready to finalize it by sanding and putting the finish on it. Oh yeah, this thing rolls really nice. I started sanding with 150 grit and then finished everything out with 220 grit. Before applying the finish, I went over everything with a damp rag just to remove any loose dust. I like using boiled linseed oil for surfaces that are going to see a lot of use. Tool handles, and in this case a workbench, because it's easy to apply, it protects the surface very well, and it's easy to reapply once you've kind of worn things in. And that finish really turned out beautiful. I especially love how that maple plywood really pops out now. The lifting mechanisms for the casters are really simple to use. It makes moving this thing around a breeze. And now it's time to add a few accessories. I start with my grandfather's bench vise, which I had recently restored. I have since changed out these regular nuts with wing nuts so I can more easily remove the vise when needed. I make a place to mount my bench grinder. You got to keep your workbench nice and clean. And of course, you need a place to open your beverages. And there's my mobile plywood top workbench all complete. But that's not the end of the story. I have since moved and I have built my own workshop, which means this workbench now has a dedicated space. So this is my 10 by 20, 200 square foot workshop. It's pretty tiny, and having things mobile like my workbench is going to be vastly important, especially as I evolve this workshop and how I work within it. I'm going to be putting casters on all my tools. And so as I'm thinking through how to use the space, I can rearrange as needed, and this workbench is perfect for that. So the workbench is home in its new space, and I'd love for you to follow along as this story continues. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos. If you do subscribe, hit that notification button so you know when I post new videos. If you like what you saw today, give me a big old thumbs up. I appreciate each and every one of you following along. Y'all get out there and make it good. Thanks a lot.